Spring is here. I love seeing the stuff starting to grow. Well, not so much that, but that takes a little while to grow. Well, enough smelling the roses. Let's get in, go get some work done. Today I'm gonna have a little help out in the garage. Tracie is gonna do some welding. She's gonna start learning how to weld. She did welding like a few years ago, tried doing it. But we made a deal. She'll teach me how to sew and I'll teach her how to weld. So we'll get set up and we'll go through the fundamentals. Well, the first part of this video is going to be just the fundamentals of welding. I'm not going to get into the amperage that you should use, the size rods, the tensile strength of the rod, all that. I just want to do a quick video on just showing the basic fundamentals of what you're trying to achieve with welding. I guess the best place to start would be what you need for tools. You need a welder. For starting, any basic MIG welder will work. You need the piece of metal that you're going to weld, a grinder to clean up the metal, and we'll get into why that's important later on. Something to hold the two pieces of metal together. A welding helmet, which is very important. Welding gloves, because you don't want to get any flash burn on your hands from welding. And ear protection for when you do grinding, but we won't get into that. And for older people, you need the reader glasses. So, I guess the best place to start is what you're trying to achieve. Basically, what you're trying to achieve with welding is to join two pieces of metal together. And how do you do that? Basically, you do that by melting the metal that you're trying to join together equally on both sides. And to strengthen the metal, you join it with a bimetal that actually combines both the metals and adds as a strengthening material. So using these pieces of paper to duplicate what you're trying to do with pieces of metal, I'll show you in a couple of minutes what we're going to try to achieve with that. So one of the thing that people struggle a little bit with first time welding is stability. You'll see a lot of guys that have done it for a long time. They use one hand and they can keep it really stable and keep it right where they want it to be. But when you're a beginner and you're trying to focus on one area that you're welding, your hand, believe it or not, tends to shake, and you're trying to do so many things at once that you can't focus on just one thing at a time. So what I tend to tell people when they're first starting is to get a nice stable arm on a table, if that's where you're welding, and have this being your stability hand and this being your control hand to control the trigger. This way, stability means a lot, because if you're shaking, the heat is going to be so erratic that you're never going to get a good weld. So when you first start, you always want to use that second hand as a stability holder. As you go along, you're going to be thinking less and less about your speed and the amount of heat you're giving and stuff like that. So you'll be able to concentrate with that single hand more. But starting out, I always recommend having a nice stable hand to hold it. So now we'll move on to how we get set up for welding. All right, so imagine this is two pieces of metal that you're trying to join together by a lap joint. A lap joint is when one laps over the other. So what I want to do is melt both pieces of metal equally right down this line and join these together. It's easier to weld when you're a beginner with thicker gauge metal, because I find that you have you're least likely to burn through the metal And that's always a pain in the neck when you're starting out, because you're still trying to figure out your heat and the speed that you go through welding. Those are the two key ingredients with welding, is the amount of heat you're producing on the metal and the amount of speed that you're using to go across the piece of metal. Too slow with too high a heat, you'll blow through and burn out the metal. Not enough heat in going too fast, either of those two, you will not get good penetration for the weld. So what we're going to do is use this Sharpie as a tool to show you how a weld is going to look along a piece of metal, and this is going to replicate this wire that comes out of this MIG welder. So when I'm trying to join these two pieces of metal and assuming that I have the right amount of heat, I want to make a little slurry of melted metal that's produced by that wire, and I want to make a little pool of melted metal in this area. And so by doing that, you want to start on one side of the piece of metal that you're joining and then rotate over into the other piece of metal. And as you're doing this at the correct speed, it will create a little pool of melted metal and the bimetal that comes from the welder, and that will make a little pool that you keep rotating and working your way down, and that will create your weld. Because as you rotate, the metal cools and it makes a little wave of melted metal, and that's when you can tell that you have a correct weld. Now, after that's done, what you want to do is look at the cross section of the weld. So let's say you have two pieces of metal that you're going to be welding together that I'm going to be setting up for Tracie in a second. Now, a weld that is not deep enough is going to rest on top of the metal. A weld that's too deep is going to blow out the bottom of the weld, and it's going to be, or piece of metal, and it's going to look like this. It's going to be very flat at the top, but it's going to go very deep. These tend to be weak because you've weakened both sides of the metal a lot. So a perfect weld is going to be, half of it's going to be above and half of it's going to be on the bottom. So it should be centered right in between like that. So now the two key ingredients, like I was mentioning before, is heat, the amount of heat that you use, and the speed that you weld. So those are the two things that make it hard for people to weld, or the hardest things for people to learn how to weld, is just getting those two key ingredients. All right, so now that we have the fundamentals on how to weld, now we're going to talk about just preparing the metal. The key part of preparing it is always making sure you clean the surfaces that you're going to weld. The reason you want to do that is because even if a piece of metal looks relatively clean, there's a lot of impurities that are on it. So any impurities that are on the metal, when they're hit with high heat, they tend to explode. Any moisture, any oil, any rust, it just tends to disrupt the slurry of metal, and you tend to get like a layer of slag. You're going to get slag anyway, even with the cleanest metal, but you want to try to limit that as much as you can. So what we're going to do today, Tracie's going to join these two pieces of metal together, and how we're going to do that is clamp these together in this position like this, and we're going to get a support just to hold it up straight. And then she's going to just work on trying to join these two pieces of metal together. Start at the beginning. The first thing you want to do, we're not ready for that yet, if you want to just put if you want to first attach the ground, which says that ground clamp That's the first thing you do. Make sure your wires are all straightened out there. You can attach the ground to somewhere that you're not welding, but to the piece of metal that you are gonna be welding together. So just not where you're welding. Perfect. All right, so now we're gonna look at the welder and we're gonna decide what piece of metal we're gonna be welding. We're gonna be welding thick metal, so we're gonna use the max setting on the power or amperage or heat, and then we'll turn it on. Good. And then we decide what the wire feed we're gonna use, like the speed. That's what I like about these kind of cheap welders. I mean, they're not as good as the Lincoln welders and the real nice welders, but they're basic enough. It works for any beginner or any basic welding that you want to do. So I find kind of the mid wire feed works pretty good, but you can tell by the amount of weld that's produced, whether that's a good setting for you. We'll see that as we go along. But that seems to work out pretty good for most applications. So now what we're gonna do is put all of our protective gear on, which looks like you have. You have your gloves, you have your helmet, you're fully clothed, all your skin is covered. So that's the basic essentials that you wanna make sure that you do. So now what we're gonna do is get set up to start joining these two pieces of metal together. They're cleaned and ready to go. So what you're gonna do, Trace, you're going to get nice and secure. We're gonna move this to a comfortable position so you can put your elbow down and brace yourself on the table. But is there any questions that you have before we get started?
I do. What is the difference between this welder and this is a welder also, right?
It is. That's a arc welder. That I tend to use for heavier gauge steel, which that's what this is too. This is heavier gauge steel we're welding. They both will weld heavy gauge metal, but that tends, in my opinion, to work better. But it's a little tougher to learn with, because what you actually end up using is welding rods instead of wire feed. And those tend to be a little tougher to use because with MIG welding, you can lock yourself into a position and the wire feeds out of the holder, and you don't have to worry about the rod deteriorating. So when you weld with a welding rod, as you weld, the rod deteriorates, it starts shrinking. So you have to manually guide that rod down to the metal and try to keep that correct distance from the metal as it's deteriorating and as it's joining the metal together. So that takes a little more, I don't want to say skill, but it's a little more, it's one extra step that you have to worry about as you're welding. As it deteriorates, you have to adjust. But you don't really have to do that so much with MIG welding, because you can hold the welder in one position and just allow the wire to feed out of the handle. So I feel like that's one step less that you have to worry about. So I feel like when you're starting out, it's a little easier to learn. Plus, arc welding, you tend to not be able to weld thin metal as good as a MIG welder, in my opinion. So that's basically the main difference. They both do ideally the same thing, they're joining metal together, but in just different ways.
Thank you.
All right, Trace, so give it a shot. See how you do.
Did I go too far away from the edge to be able to see?
Yeah, no, you can kind of tell too. If you look at the side of the weld, if you can see it, most of the weld at the top, it's one of two things. Either you've gone too slow and the weld, or your feed is on too fast and it's bubbled up on the top of it, or it means that you haven't stayed there long enough or you don't have enough power. It's definitely not the power because we're on the highest setting and it should definitely be enough. But it might be that you didn't hold it there long enough and it didn't penetrate.
Okay.
So what I'd like you to do to begin with, if you wanted to try to go in a straight line, we'll hold this seam off for the graduating part of it. We'll just try to do a straight line of weld, and as you go along, the more time that you're doing it, you'll be able to adjust more.
Okay.
If you do a spot weld, you're shrinking your time limit down so close that you don't really get a true feel of what it takes to melt the metal. So if you go on a line, you might start out too fast at the beginning, but you can adjust and go slower. And then you might go too slow and then you can go fast. That's what's good about welding in a straight line.
Okay, all right, I'll try it. What is the kicking? It like kicks back. Oh, that's horrible. What is that? What did I even do?
That's the feed might be a little too fast.
That's awful.
Yeah, that's all right.
Can we edit that? Wait, let me get the grinder.
Let me try it with
the grinder. That's odd. And I couldn't even see that I was near the end. I thought I was only, an inch in here.
Well, what we're gonna do is just clean that up again.
Like with the grinder?
Yeah.
Please, thank you. Hold on a second. I don't want anybody to see that.
So Trace, I'm gonna just show you an example. Hopefully mine comes out halfway decent.
Yeah, because that's horrible. Are you supposed to be able to see when you're using that helmet?
Yes.
Do you need your glasses?
But this helmet isn't that good. So.
Oh, that helmet is horrible. I couldn't see anything.
All right, so. So that's a half decent weld. It could penetrate a little bit deeper. Let me try it again. Even at that, this is why I like arc welding for heavier gauge steel. But that's a half decent weld. You can see where they've joined together and made that. That should be good. So if you want to just practice with that, you want it to look similar to this here.
Now how come you bang it?
The covering on this is the flux and slag, the impurities.
Okay. So you want to get that off?
Yeah, you want to just clean it off. Especially if you're going to re-weld it too, you want to clean up the area.
So you would grind it down again?
Yeah, yep.
I'm not going to lie, I think I'm going to stick to stained glass. This is tough.
But give it a shot. Just clean this up again and
clean
just
it
work
up
on
again?
that.
Okay.
Well, Tracie's practicing her welding over there. I'm going to start replacing these lower parts right here. I'm going to actually cut this out right to the bottom here and make an L piece that goes right next to this bracket here and attach it to here and on this side here. I'm going to remove this rotted piece of metal and attach it right to the part that has substantial metal left right here. This part right here is all rusted, so I'm going to get rid of that. Seeing it from the back side, it'll be taking this right across here. And what I'm going to do is just lap joint it here and bend it, make an L piece that's going to connect to this lower subframe here. So I'm going to get started on that now. I'm going to use a heavier gauge steel, even heavier than the original steel I was using for the like the gusset here. This is like a thicker gauge steel. I think that's 17 gauge. So I'm going to use something that's even thicker than that. I have an old piece of metal that I got from an oil tank, which is really thick. I think it's like 1/8 inch steel. So I'm going to use that just so it has a little more substance to weld to. So those pieces worked out really good. I got those all welded in and secured this side member onto the new piece that I fabricated. And what's really good is now, I already did this once, but I'll show you, the tailgate works really well. Hinges down, and both sides are very sturdy. That's a good place to be. So now I'm thinking for the rest of the day, Tracie did some welding, got some good practice in. Shane's working on his carburetors for his motorcycle. It's such a nice day. I think I'm gonna take the rest of the day and go out and take the Scout and the MG out of the temporary garages. I'll bring you guys along and we'll have a cold start on them. Cold start on the Scout and potentially the MG. In the next coming week or so, I want to put these back on the road and get them ready for the summer season. I usually like to put these on the road for about 6 months at a time. So we'll give it a shot, see how it starts up. went better than I expected, especially this one. Usually this one's a little cold-blooded when it starts. So it started up really well. I rebuilt the carburetors last summer, and it definitely helped for the startup. Surprised how good these started for sitting. They've been sitting for about, I would say about 6 months, and they've started really well. So those two are ready for the summer. I'm just going to go through the fluids, make sure everything's good, give them a fresh charge on the battery, but that's going to be about it for today. Tyler is talking that he wants to start working on the Willys, the CJ2A, so we'll see what he wants to do with that, see if he wants to start on some of the body work. But the next project I'll probably be working on is continuing, probably still on the welding of the bed, but probably the next thing I'm going to want to start doing before it gets nicer out is get the wiring figured out on the FC. The lights work, but really not much of anything else works. So that's going to be about it for today. I'll see you guys next week. I hope everybody has a great week, and thanks for watching.